This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting off the show is Chip Redmond, Sarah Lancaster, and Kelsey Andersen Onofre as they chat about how the previous above-average temperatures and now cold temperatures have impacted weeds and wheat. Part of the Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policies podcast continues today's show as Jenny Ifft, Brad Lubben, Joe Glauber, and Eric Atkinson talk about the current state of the agricultural economy. K-State Extension Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, ends the show discussing things gardeners can do now to get ready for planting this spring. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show discussing how the weather has impacted wheat and weeds with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond, K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster, and K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre. Chip, Sarah, Kelsey, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Chip, first want to talk about what the weather has been. And over that holiday season, usually I think of it being pretty cold and winter-like. However, not what we saw this year. And how does that impact soil temperatures and soil moisture?
Yeah, so we did have warm temperatures throughout December. The month as a whole ran about 5 to 8 degrees above normal, warmest in the far western side of the state, and it was completely dry. We had that little bit of moisture with some snow at the beginning of December, but since then it had been completely dry. We went to early January with about 40 days without wetting precipitation in a lot of the state. As we got into January, we started really, really warm, and we had temperatures 20, 30 degrees above normal. It was impressive. In fact, as we went through the first week of January, week and a half really even, we were running about 10 to 15 degrees above normal for the whole state on average, which is an incredible feat. And that resulted in soil temperatures. Their average temperatures are around 32 degrees, and we were seeing soil temperatures approach the 50-degree mark for the whole state. And we finally got that first storm in January that brought precipitation for all but the northwest corner. And we also saw that snow in the southwest, but widespread, half inch, 3/4 of an inch of moisture that helped the soil finally get some moisture in it, and then also brought those soil temperatures back down close to the normal. And obviously, we've had some recent cold as we record this, and so now soil temperatures are much closer to normal. They're at that freezing mark again, but it's moist. And now we've had some cold air as well to offset some of those warmer temperatures.
And when we're thinking about the weather and having the warmth and then this cold weather, any concerns you see from your perspective?
Well, when we average out really warm conditions to start January and really cold conditions to finish January, we end up average. So that's where statistics starts to play a role in meteorology, where we get these periods of extremes, but that's winter in Kansas, right? And so it's just a reminder that can bring really dynamic conditions that are frustrating from a producer standpoint and might make decision-making difficult.
Wanting to take a look at weeds, and Sarah, when we looked at that warmer period of time, did we see extra weed growth or anything along those lines?
Yeah, certainly. With the temperatures that we had going through, through Christmas and early January, the winter annual weeds are still, certainly getting bigger and in some cases potentially, seeing some additional germination, maybe, depending on soil temperatures at a location. So, yes, we are going to see more winter annual weed growth going into kind of the spring, right? Because now we've got snow, so they're going to hang out under that snow and this really, really cold temperatures. So we probably will see more winter annual weeds going into the spring. I think that's going to be particularly bad news for some of our folks who have been fighting with the armyworm problems in their pastures, and we're already kind of concerned about, how are they going to manage weeds in those weekend stands. For our summer crop guys, in a way, the warm weather was actually a plus. I know folks were still spraying fall applied and herbicides right up through, right at the beginning of this cold snap. So in a way, it gave folks an extended period of time to get some of those kind of preventative herbicide applications down here this fall and winter. So now we're probably paused until we get to warmer weather in the spring. But in a way, the long kind of open warm fall was good from a weed management perspective.
For those weeds, however, that did get bigger, are we going to have more trouble killing them?
So the bigger the weed, the more herbicide it's going to take to kill it. And the other thing we find, Shelby, and the way I say this is probably going to be a net benefit, is because fall emerged weeds are easier to control in the fall than they are in the spring. And so since we were able to get more fall herbicide applications down, we were probably able to control more fall emerged weeds. Does that make sense? And so now, anything that wasn't sprayed is going to probably be bigger because it did have a lot longer to grow. But it was going to be a challenge to control anyway, just because of the fact that it had overwintered. So, when I have these conversations, I'm thinking about things like horseweed or mare's tail, right? Same weed, two names. That's kind of one of the classic troublesome kind of cool season species that we have. And we know if we can get it sprayed in the fall, we're a lot better off.
Is there anything this cold snap we're experiencing is going to do to weeds?
I mean, so things that are, not hardened off, obviously, or protected by the snow, they're gonna get frozen and die back or go dormant, depending on, the situation there. So, this will be a giant pause button for the horseweeds and the chickweeds and the henbits and all that stuff that we were seeing come up this fall.
You mentioned armyworms, Sarah. And so thinking about then wheat, we talk a lot about wheat curl mites, wheat streak mosaic virus. Any extra concerns for that or how the wheat might handle it?
Yeah, great question. So I think when we talk about this topic of warm, open falls, right, one of the things we can be thinking about are our wheat curl mites and our wheat streak mosaic, right? So after 2025, obviously, this was a big topic. We had some big campaigns coming into the summer of 2025 to control volunteer wheat, but unfortunately there was still volunteer wheat out there, right? And now what happens is we had really good moisture for wheat and volunteer wheat growth and development, right, through the fall. And we also had that warm weather that favored the curl mite development, right? So again, when we have mild temperatures, when we're in the 50s, 60s in the fall, those curl mite populations can continue to build and can continue to cycle, right? And that's when we see those curl mites kind of marching across fields and causing pretty widespread damage, right? Now, the unfortunate thing, Shelby, that I always have to remind people is that we don't see symptoms from those infections until we start hitting the April green up time frame, right? That March-April time frame. So we can be a little bit worried right now. So I'm a little bit worried. I wouldn't say we can totally say for sure, right, that we're going to have another bad wheat streak year, but we did have the conditions for those curl mite populations to build, right, and they could have caused some damage, and we'll have to see after green up really what the situation is there. I do know folks were on top of their volunteer, right, and that's going to be a big plus, right? So I think it'll be kind of a case-by-case situation. But again, that warm fall, that's not good because those curl mites, they just don't kind of go down into their kind of shutdown mode over winter until we really get probably now, right, in these really cold conditions. And they'll be pretty shut down through this cold period until we warm up again. The other concern is leaf rust, right? So we talked about leaf rust a few weeks back. We've gotten questions about that still. So we had this warm weather through the fall. It caused leaf rust to pick up, especially in southwest Kansas, southeast Colorado. And that wet, warm weather was just good for it to take off, right? So you might drive by a field, looks kind of yellow, walk in, it's actually leaf rust. We even saw some powdery mildew out, all sorts of fungal diseases that just enjoyed that warm, wet weather. So hopefully now they're dying off, right? With this cold weather and snow that we're getting, they should be dying off. The wheat leaves will die off and it'll kill off those pathogens with them. The only issue is if we get good snow cover, sometimes that can cause the leaf tissue to stay a little bit warmer and for those pathogens to survive, right? So sometimes in some years, maybe 30% of years, we'll see leaf rust survive the winter just because it was buffered by that snow cover, right? So we're going to need some periods of no snow and cold weather, freezing weather to really kill off any leaf rust that was lingering before this cold snap, right? So again, it'll really matter this year what happens in February when it comes to these fungal diseases. February, March, those conditions will really kind of drive what happens in the spring for our fungal diseases.
Are we going to get some cold weather with no snow, Chip?
Has it not been cold enough? We had a lot of cold weather this week, and temperatures definitely well below normal, but we had the snow before it. And, the snowfall, just looking at the forecast out for beyond the next week, and the amount of snow we have on the ground in places, I think it's going to be hard to melt off a lot of this snow. I think Western Kansas had the least amount of snow. They're gonna see temperatures warm back up. I mean, they're already approaching 40s and even 50s this week, and that snow melted off right away. It's also the drier soils, so that's good. That'll get that cold temperature at that soils in Western Kansas, but Central Eastern Kansas, it's gonna be hard to melt off the snow. It's such a large area that it manipulates the temperatures and keeps overall conditions colder and more humid and just more challenging to melt off that snow. Going to keep insulating that ground, I think, really into early February.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond, and he was joined by K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster and K-State wheat pathologist Kelsey Andersen Onofre as they discussed weather's impact on weeds and wheat. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by a collection of agricultural economists as they discuss the current state of the agricultural economy. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of a Barry Flinchbaugh Center for Ag and Food Policy podcast episode. On today's episode, you'll hear from Eric Atkinson, Kansas State University's Jenny Ifft, University of Nebraska's Brad Lubben, and their special guest, Joe Glauber, who's with the International Food Policy Research Institute.
To start with, anyway, get your 30,000-foot view of present day, and as far as our agricultural trade status, and then relating back to the general ag economy. Now, that's a huge area to cover, but just some things that jump out at you initially that are going on that bear close watching in your view.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a very unusual time. I mean, certainly compared to anything I've seen in 40 years. Just on the one hand, the trade wars at a time when the global agricultural economy is, we've seen this decline in prices following, the big run up we saw coming out of COVID and with the war in Ukraine. We had record high nominal prices at the time, and then they've been declining. And the world is very competitive. The good news is we don't have to be the lowest cost to sell product, but we have to be one of the lowest costs. And we can't, that's where when you see things like tariffs hitting, it hurts our competitiveness. And even now with with this kind of truce in the trade war with China, we are still struggling with an additional 10% tariff on soybeans that essentially makes us less competitive with Brazil and other oilseed suppliers. And for someone who spent a lot of my career working on things like NAFTA negotiations, Uruguay round negotiations, I'm very much involved with them at the time, and then Doha negotiations, and then TPP, all those things. To sort of see them viewed as not even less valuable. I mean, really actively changing in the sense of now going back and trying to raise tariffs on a lot of goods and things. I think that's very unfortunate. And I think it's short. I hope that, this is just a short interval where we get back on a path towards a more open trading environment. Because I think, U.S. agriculture has really benefited from that. And I think that to turn your back on world markets and expect, compensation's nice. And I think it's understandable given the price effects we've seen, but it's hard to think that that's sustainable over the long run. And so that's, again, my biggest concern right now is just what I see there.
Well, Joe, how all of this resonates at the farm gate, if you would. It obviously is an important subject when it comes to the profitability of farming today. What does your crystal ball say? What's this going to look like for the farmer out there in the next 2 to 3 years as we have this trade and tariff free-for-all, it seems, in some respects?
It is just so hard. The better case scenario, obviously, is that these trade agreements amount to something, that we do see increased trade in some of these countries where we've struck these bargains, that we don't see further deterioration in terms of counter retaliation. I think that hopefully we'll see a more normalized relationship with China. And we are in one sense in just a downturn in the global ag economy. I mean, it's not just the U.S. Other countries are also suffering from low prices. That won't last forever. We will see prices return, I think, at some point, whether or not doesn't look like it's this year unless we see some unforeseen drought somewhere right now. But it wouldn't take much to turn prices around, I think, in terms of a weather disturbance. I mean, global stocks are still relatively tight. They've built up, but it doesn't take much to have some poor harvest in a major wheat producing country could really turn prices around very quickly, I think.
You're talking like global markets and export opportunities still fundamentally matter and help drive the demand equation for U.S. ag. Do you expect that to rebound and be the case, or are we on the cusp of sort of ignoring global competition and focusing on domestic utilization with biofuels and other options?
Boy, I certainly hope it's the case, Brad. I mean, I think that as much as domestic demand, I mean, I think that clearly has been, no question, the ethanol boom that we saw in the late 2000s, has really contributed to that. The fact that we're seeing corn prices now, probably 50% higher than they would have been otherwise. I mean, that's just a huge chunk of the ethanol grind is such a big component of the corn crop. If you think you can push blend rates to higher levels nationally, that's one issue. If you think you can, through subsidies and other things or mandates, push sustainable aviation fuel, I mean, those are all big potentials for that market. Similar with biodiesel, we've seen this big increase. But at the end of the day, you still have limits in terms of overall fuel economies, other things, those markets. I think trade is just such an enormous, it's something you can't turn your back on. And what I don't think is sustainable is, Congress providing, or the administration providing big supplemental bills year after year. I mean, this has just been incredible over the last 5 or 6 years.
I think we're in an ad hoc era of foreign policy right now. And I'm curious, if we look back, I'd say the first 6 decades of foreign policy, you had a system of price support, supply management, where the government, we had the set-aside policy, storing grain. And I think at the very beginning, people knew that maybe wasn't sustainable, but it took 6 decades to really unravel it. And I'm curious if you could see any parallels with our current ad hoc era, perhaps in terms of cost. Is what we're doing now actually more cost? And I know, I emailed you about this, I think 4 years ago, is it getting to be more costly than storage? And I know that's that system we had. Are there also sustainability concerns? Is this just going to keep going?
You're the young one here. The rest of us remember, certainly the 80s when you had successive farm bills and budget actions that were trying to wring out as much as possible from the budget, not just the ag budget, but the budget overall. If you think about coming into the 80s, we had a farm bill that was really hemorrhaging money by the early 80s. And, Congress stepped in and said, okay, wait a minute, we're going to control budget a little bit by putting in set-asides. And the next thing you know, you had this over-regulated market where 1988, when we had a drought in the Midwest and we had soybean prices, I think a soybean to corn ratio of almost 3.5 we couldn't get anyone to shift into soybeans. And why? Because if they did it, they lost their corn base. Just was a terrible regulated system. And I think that, a lot of people argued to Congress, a lot of ag economists like Barry and others said, hey, try to get, let markets drive these producer acreage decisions, and you'll be in, the markets will do a much, much better job of allocating resources, and you don't need the government to be telling farmers what to plant. And I think that was a real positive development out of all of that. And frankly, we did pretty well over several years. COVID sort of changed. I think the trade war was the first kind of big thing, and all of a sudden, the China market, which had been so dominant, they were our number one trading partner. When that was hit in 2018 and 2019, again, you came in with a lot of money, provided compensation. It wasn't perfect. And unfortunately, the longer run losses were even worse that weren't even compensated. So you saw Brazil all of a sudden plant, I think over the 3 years following 2018, they planted like 15 million acres of soybeans. I mean, it's just all of a sudden a huge market share increase, and in global markets, let alone in China. And then you had COVID and all the monies that went out there. And I think all these authorities like the Commodity Credit Corporation Charter Act, where no one thought about using, or, it was used a little bit with, here's a 10 million, we could provide farmers for this. All of a sudden, you replace those millions with billions. And, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that assistance shouldn't have been provided, but I think it got too easy in one sense to kind of do that. That I think in the old, in the 80s, 90s, even 2000s, if there was a disaster in Congress, weighed and said, okay, we're going to have a supplemental bill here, ad hoc disaster bill. We know what it costs. Here's what it is. We're going to provide that money. That was a much more deliberate process. I think all this ad hoc stuff, the using CCC Charter Act, has really kind of undermined a lot of that discipline, and I don't think it's helped agriculture, frankly.
With your general thoughts on how do you feel about the next 5 years agriculturally, from the trade, from the domestic economy perspective, just some general thoughts?
I think generally if we can get back to markets, the U.S. agriculture will do just fine. I think we're still one of the low-cost producers in the world. We're very competitive in most of the products that we produce and sell in the world, and that alone will ensure that we'll be in good shape over the next 5-10 years. I think where we get hurt is when agriculture becomes collateral damage because of other actions taken.
Once again, that was Joe Glauber, Brad Lubben, Jenny Ifft, and Eric Atkinson. If you'd like to hear the full podcast episode, I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also search for it by searching for the podcast Smoke and Mirrors Ag Policy Unfiltered. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. For gardeners, now is an excellent time to think about last year's gardening experience and decide what, if any, changes they'd like to make this year. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, says this is also a good time for checking the viability of leftover seeds and securing seeds for this year's garden. Greg's still too early to do any work outside in the garden, but a great time to be planning the garden, and there's really quite a few steps that go into this.
There is. Definitely want to think about what we did last year and what was successful, what wasn't. Can be a lot of weather-related situations, but maybe some of our practices need to be improved. And we have this winter break to read up and learn about different practices and get out there and think about planning for the spring.
If you have an existing garden, do we need to do a soil test again? Is that something you recommend yearly?
Soils are interesting creatures, and they don't change a whole lot. So if you haven't done a soil test ever, I would definitely encourage you to do that. If you had to make some changes because your soil test results didn't come back the way we'd like, then you may want to test again to see how well your adjustments have made. But typically, if you're not doing a lot of weird things to our soil, it's pretty stable. And maybe every 5, 10, 15 years you might test.
If you want to expand your garden, things went well last year and you think, I'd like to grow a few more things, adding on to that side, is that fairly easy to do?
That is, it depends on what was growing there previously. If it's turf, which oftentimes may be the situation, we can till that up and incorporate that organic matter. Now, we do have some perennial type of grasses that can send out rhizomes and roots and things that we may want to kill off, so to speak, with maybe a herbicide or some shading of materials to kill that off, which may take a while if you're doing that and may miss your spring planting, but could be ready for some summer or fall planting. Herbicides work a little quicker, and that would be a solution for quick planting this spring.
How early do we need to get started on deciding what we want to grow?
Probably last year, depending on what your family likes to eat. That's always a big factor. We have some plants that are very easy to grow, but if nobody likes them, then that's probably not going to take up a whole lot of space in your garden. But also collecting seeds or checking out your seed inventory. Many seeds will last probably 3 years, kept cool and dry, and be viable. A quick test, get 10 seeds, put it on a moist paper towel, put it in a sandwich bag, close it up, and check it 5-6 days later and see how many of those 10 seeds sprouted. If you got 80% germination, that's pretty good. Go ahead and use that. If you got 50%, just plant your seeds a little thicker and assume that most of them will fit the schedule of coming up.
You're kind of hitting on the fact that we also need to know when things need to be planted, so maybe consulting the Kansas Garden Guide might be a good start?
That's definitely the go-to publication in Kansas. Now it's going to be on averages, and the weather conditions will have a factor on that. But typically mid-April is our last frost date, and our soils are warming up, so you can kind of use that as a guide. We do have the weather stations across Kansas that you can check out. The Mesonet, you can take your soil probe, put it out there, your thermometer, and test the soil, because that's going to determine when our seeds will start to germinate and when we should be planting. Usually about 2 inches is a good reference point. Obviously, it's going to be warmer on top, so if you're planting lettuce, which needs a very shallow planting, it's going to warm up quicker, and you could plant those maybe a little quicker than your soil reading is going to indicate on your thermometer.
And I guess as we're planting, we need to know where we've planted things, so maybe a good layout of the garden?
Yeah, it's great to rotate our crops. Many of our gardens may not be big enough to do that as best as we'd like to, but it's always good not to plant your tomatoes in the same spot year after year. And that's a family of plants, so eggplant, peppers, those are all in the same family. So ideally, we would move those if we could. Container gardening is an option for some of us small gardeners. You can always plant some of these crops, and they do very well in a container. And that kind of give you that rotation.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with information for planting this year's garden. For more information, check out the Kansas Garden Guide or contact your local extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.